Hi, I'm Phil Harvey with Light Reading, and we are here at Fiber Connect in Nashville. And joining me right now is James Stegeman, the CEO of CostQuest. James, first of all, this might be the easiest interview question ever. Who are you and what do you do?
So CostQuest is a economic modeling firm. We specialize in broadband deployment. We've written and deployed economic models for the FCC. So the original Universal Service Fund that was deployed by the FCC, our models distributed over $4 billion to all the carriers. And simply we identified what the high cost parts of the country were and what were not. We transitioned from that. We do a lot of property tax work now for carriers, cable companies, cell phone companies, wireless companies. They all have to pay property tax just like you do to your county assessor.
Sure.
They have to pay it on their plant in certain states. So we'll help value their plant as they go into those states. We help states and carriers as they deploy broadband, so we'll run economic models for them. And in those economic models, we look at the cost of deployment, the cost of operations, to come up with that business case so that they can understand, does it make economic sense to deploy here? So they use that information for that. States and cities use it for planning purposes. So as all this broadband money comes available from the federal government, states are going to run it. The states have to identify how to identify which parts of the state get the money, which I'll talk about in a second. But two, they got to come up with kind of programs to distribute that money out. We can help those states identify, you need $1,000 per home passed here. It's probably going to be $2,000 per home passed in this location. And they can use that to develop their plan. So that's kind of the third part. The fourth part, which is probably the most interesting, relating to kind of why we're here today, is we were selected by the FCC for the National Broadband Fabric. So we've created a database of 114 million or so building footprints in the US. So we know the exact latitude and longitude of that building, or a point on the building. And what we've identified are those that either A, have broadband service, or B, require broadband service. So it's an extensive database of potentially all the demand points in the country, including the territories, Alaska, Hawaii. So everything is in it. The FCC is using that to distribute to all the broadband providers. So AT&T, Comcast, Charter, Blue Ridge Telephone, every ISP provider has to report to the FCC which of those locations they provide broadband service to, what technology and what speed. The FCC will then, from that data, from about 3,500 providers, they will then identify which locations are unserved, so under 25.3 for broadband, and which locations are underserved, so under 120. So that information will then be passed over to NTIA. NTIA will then use that to distribute the $42 billion. So our fabric is just kind of an underlying normalization data set on which everybody will be working. And it's actually being cut today. The first official version will be shipped to the FCC this week for them to incorporate into the process, and then that will be distributed out to the ISPs later this month. So we're at the starting point of this whole effort. Which will then trigger the spend of why all these equipment carriers or equipment companies are here trying to sell broadband equipment, is basically, that money that's coming available from the federal government.
How does the, what you're able to provide the FCC now differ in terms of the old maps, in terms of the data sets available, or the data sets that you've been able to, to assemble?
So in the past, so probably for the last 6 or 7 years, the FCC has done what they call the 477 process. And in that, the 3,500 or so ISPs had to report which census blocks they provided service to. So a census block is just a unit of census geography, averages about 20 homes per census block across the US. Some are real large, some are small. And they simply, if they served one, or if they served them all, they reported that to the FCC that census block was served. The issue that came up, or has come up over time, has become a political issue, it's what they call the unserved, all served issue, that
Yeah.
I may serve one point at the edge of the census block, but the
Right.
rest of the homes are unserved.
Yeah.
There's no funding that goes out to those customers. No one has knowledge that they don't have service. The customer goes onto the 477 map. It says that they're served by, ABC telephone company. They call for service and they tell them, no, we don't provide service. But the FCC map says it does. So this became an issue in Congress. I testified before congressional committees, one on the cost of broadband deployment, but two on this broadband mapping issue. And that testimony, along with others, is really what triggered the Broadband Data Collection Act, which said we need to solve this and go from census blocks down to location level. So it's an expansion of, there's about 7.5 million blocks reported to the FCC with service. We're now going to go to 114 million individual points at which people will be able to tell service. So
a lot more granular data, and then a lot less of a likely of a chance that entire, chunks of the population are going to get missed just because somebody on the edge of their census block had service or was served by a provider.
Exactly, and that's really why it's being deployed, is really to help uncover those unserved locations. But in part, this will come down to how well the broadband providers actually report.
Okay.
It's a brand new process.
Sure.
The providers got a beta version of our fabric a month and a half ago, I think it was, so that they could start the exercise and the thought process. Because going from census block level to point level or location level is a big change.
Yeah.
And they have to determine which systems they have can support that, how they're going to pull the information, how they link it to our data set. So there's a lot of thought exercise that has to go on behind the scenes. And hopefully that gets done. The broadband providers have to report September 1st. They'll get our fabric, I think, on June, the official version, on June 30th. So they'll have, 2 months to pull their filing together.
Okay.
So it'll be a first-of-a-kind effort. Hopefully that first round is really good, but as all things that the first time you do it, there's going to be issues that come up.
Sure.
So we'll just have to work through those as they come up.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about. Like, what sort of challenges do you anticipate, in dealing with the broadband providers who are getting used to this new process, and then maybe are also really worried that maybe the new process uncovers something that was quite comfortable for them. I'm not gonna say much more than that. I think people watching will understand what I mean. But what are some of the challenges inherent in that journey?
Yeah, it's one. It's trying to understand what the FCC is looking for. So it's one, communication from the FCC. This is what we want you to provide to us. This is what is a served location.
Okay.
So the FCC gets that out. The challenge for the ISPs, and we've talked to a number already. One told us, well, we're simply just going to pull our billing system addresses. Those are the ones we serve, and we'll file that. The problem is most like phone companies have a 30% take rate. So every other third customer on the street will be in their billing database. The ones in between, they likely serve. It's probably, if the customer calls up and orders service, they can get it. So it's really making sure the broadband providers know, not necessarily to rely on their billing database. They either need to look at their cable system footprint, they need to look at their provisioning databases, they need to look at where they can provision service to, not the customers they serve today. So it's just a little bit of a differentiation, but they really need to make sure that's what they really target with the information.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, I mean, it seems like everything's still on path then to be delivered by the fall, right? The new map.
Yeah, I mean, we were under a 120-day time window to get our fabric to the FCC, which was today.
Okay.
We are meeting that today. The FCC, on their side, is developing the broadband data collection system, so they've developed all the tools and software needed for the ISPs to file their information, so that's been tested and they're working through that. So from everything I'm aware of, and I don't work for the FCC, I don't know all the system details,
sure.
But from what I'm aware of, everything looks on target for the ISPs to file their data on September 1st, and for the FCC to turn that relatively quickly. Exact time frame, I don't know, but it's based on everything I know, it's right on schedule.
I know you can't comment with too granular detail because it's obvious, maybe it's proprietary, but what technology goes into more accurate mapping in the way that you guys are doing it at CostQuest?
It's a good question. So what providers have done in the past is they use a tool, a geocoder. So it's basically when you go into Google, type in your address, it takes you to a point. The issue there is there's no verification that address actually has a building on it. It's just, It's an address. The other issue is in rural areas, the referential data underlying it doesn't necessarily tell you the exact point. It approximates the point, and it can be pretty far off. So maybe you've experienced it where you typed in an address into Google, and you go there and it ain't where you're supposed to be. And you're like, what in the heck? And in part, it's just the referential data is off.
Okay.
So that's one part. The second part is, it's the extent of the data. It's back to, is there actually a structure at this address? And does it need broadband? So that's kind of what we bring to the effort. So that's kind of, we're trying to solve the issue of the referential data underlying it. So what we do is we've got partners that we work with that provide us data. So we've got parcel boundaries, so it's legal ownership of land. So we understand that. And then on those parcels, we have a data set of building footprints. So the building footprints it's a polygon from satellite imagery or aerial imagery that they developed AI that actually traces the boundary of the building.
Okay.
So we bring that in. We also bring in tax assessor information that tells us, is it a single family? What's the home improvement value? What's the size of the primary structure? And then we've got some other data fields or databases that come through with addressing information, census information, and we boil that together. We've been working on this for around 3 years now, trying to figure out how you can layer all that information together, come up with machine learning that really identifies which building on the parcel, say there's a garage, a barn, and the house. How do we identify the house? And then two, how do we make sure that is a broadband serviceable location? So we've gone through subject matter reviews. So we've reviewed tens of thousands of images, my staff.
Okay.
We stare at it, we click it and go, yeah, that's the one. And then we incorporate that in as our learning tool into the machine learning or our statistical models to say, this is how you select it. So it's really just an expansion of just data mining.
Okay.
Is what we're about, combined with our expertise. We've been doing broadband for 20 years. We kind of know what broadband is. We know what broadband locations look like, so we're able to capture our knowledge and pull that into this data mining exercise.
As I was talking to our staff, we were doing a bit of research on CostQuest, and we think you might actually know exactly how big the digital divide is. What is your estimate of how big the digital divide is? Because when we look at things like the FCC map, it's something like 19 million. Other estimates have put it as high as 100 million. How does CostQuest sort of, or does it put a number on it, or do you have some thoughts on how big of a problem we're looking at?
Yes, it's a good question. So we've actually modeled it.
Okay.
So we have worked with a number of states and a number of providers and actually got their deployment level data. We've combined it with our fabric, and from that we've put together statistical models to say, does this location actually have access to this technology? Yes or no? So it's fiber, cable, fixed wireless, and copper. We've run that nationally. And based upon our estimates, the total count of served and unserved, so the first part of the digital divide is actually having access to. So from that aspect, we're in the 23 to 25 million locations.
Okay.
Or units across the country, which is a bit higher than the FCC, lower than some of the other estimates that you've seen.
Yeah.
But we really try and estimate it based upon, do they have access to a technology?
Okay.
Cable, for the most part, if you have access to cable, you're likely either served are underserved. Underserved is they just haven't deployed higher speed ones.
Yeah.
If you've got access to fiber, you're most likely served. It's the copper technologies and the fixed wireless in which our models really come into play and help us understand which potential locations just don't have access to that service. So it's probably about 25 million.
That's interesting, and that's a closer number or a tighter range than I was expecting. Yeah. I appreciate that. James Stegeman, this is the only broadband economics conversation I've actually looked forward to today. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, and it's been fun talking to you today.